Kurt, welcome to the W2 Prison Break Show. Excited to
Hey,
have
thank
you
you for
on.
having me.
Yeah, you bet. We're going to talk about some cool stuff today. We were talking a little bit offline about your fractional business. That's all I'm going to say, folks. He's got a fractional business. This is very popular. We're going to talk about that. And he's also a speaker. He's been a keynote speaker for a long time. You've got multiple side hustles, but maybe give us a little bit of context into some of the W2 jobs. This is the W2 Prison Break Show that you've had and how you kind of got into some of the stuff that you're doing now.
Yeah, great question that. So I've had, I'd say, dominantly W-2 jobs, although I've almost always had side hustles, which have often led to sometimes really good paychecks at the end of the day. But I mean, I came out of school and went to a small company called Navigation Technologies, became Navtech, now it's called here. We think about Garmin's back in the day, or MapQuest, or Microsoft Flight Simulator back there. This was the data source and traffic source across all of those internationally. And so I rose to that company. Ended up working in marketing and business development for them. We took the company from 85 million a year in revenue to 1.44 billion.
Wow.
Kind of at the center, though, of 11 industries over 10 and a half years. Went to another company in the marketing technology space, leading strategy and marketing there. We sold it to Oracle. All while I'm doing this, I had side hustles as well. Like at that company I mentioned, Navtech, I started a blog. I did really well with it. I started wanting to pull in different articles and summarize things. So I wrote a little bit of a code to be able to pull that in from RSS feeds and ended up selling it to AOL right before the dot-com blow up, which was great for me, probably wasn't so good for them. But I tend to always be doing things like that. But at that first company, and I've had W-2 jobs since then, I was in a place industry-wise to start speaking at events for the company. And so speaking at the Game Developers Conference, GDC, speaking at E3 about how to use our data in there. And so that started giving me a little bit of credibility public speaking. And people went, well, can you come speak here? So still a corporate job, but they paid for me to fly to Spain to go speak at conferences and fly to Germany. Well, then I'm like, well, I'm good at marketing. Can I
Mhm.
do this myself? So I started reaching out to a few conferences as a non W-2. So, but just as myself, and started getting some speaking jobs here and there. This was back in like the early 2000s. Well, fast forward a few more W-2 jobs. I thought I'd be great. Then I would do a startup. So I started a technology company. It's not breaking out of the W-2, because when you go start a company and you hire people and you go raise money, it's actually the worst of the W-2s. When you take investment dollars, you get a boss that's expecting a return of like
Yeah.
5x to 10x. That was not for me. And so as we fast forward a little bit, I ended up being brought into a technology company. EXP World Holdings bought it. I became an executive there for 2.5 years, grew that large real estate company, and stepped out the end of September last year because I'd started looking at doing more public speaking again. It was a big part of my job with EXP. My wife and I really liked that idea. And so as part of stepping out, I decided to get back into fractional executive work. So where I work with, 3 to 4 companies at any one time.
Okay, great. So can you explain what that is? We take it for granted, fractional, but can you please explain for the audience what exactly that means? And then I'll follow up with some other questions on details.
Yeah, great question. Because there's a lot of confusion about it as well. I was just in this big report and survey that came out from a company called DataBox. There are consultants, and consultants are different than an hourly temp people. Those are different than fractional executives. As a consultant, you come in on a project, but you're on the outside. As a fractional executive, fractional chief marketing officer in my place, companies bring me in when they can't afford me full time, but they need the expertise that I have. So I'm not a consultant. It's a longer term agreement. They're usually 12 months at a time minimum. There's often equity and upside as the company develops. So they're kind of buying talent they couldn't otherwise have, but bringing in a member of the team where I interact with every other member of the team as if I was there full time, really. And I say there's confusion because at least in the marketing world or sometimes sales, you have agencies that come in. That's a marketing agency that builds websites or just link building, writes content, and they'll sell themselves as a fractional CMO, but then they outsource all of the work back to their agency. As a real fractional executive, I would never believe in doing that, and most fractionals wouldn't, because as a W-2 employee, you wouldn't ever outsource stuff to your wife or your kid. That's kind of nepotism at that point.
Hmm.
And so as that fractional CMO, I'm making the best decision. My vendors, my partners, I have people that I've worked with for decades. They always get set up as a vendor to the company, and then I implement through that.
Okay. So to give that back to you, just to be clear, everyone listening, fractional, you are not subbing out any of the work. You're doing it all. You're just working for multiple companies as opposed to one as a W-2, correct?
Correct. And so I'm the 1099 with mo is usually how that works. You can now W-2 a fractional executive, but most of us, like I bill through an S corp.
Okay, got it. Now I would assume, and you tell me if I'm wrong, that because you're spreading it out, maybe you're working 10 hours for this company and 20 hours for this one, or you're actually earning more because you have multiple companies, or maybe you're earning the same as if you had one big W-2 job. True or false?
It depends on who's in that fractional role. For me, the key for me is the flexibility. I want to work fully remote. We have a big mountain property, and so when I want to go see my kid at school or to go hiking in the middle of the day, as a fractional, that's a huge benefit to me, where most W-2s are never going to allow you to do that.
Okay. You answer my next question is why did you choose this business model? Maybe you have something to add there. Do you have anything to add there as to why you chose this
Well,
over the agency?
yeah, well, from an agency perspective, if I'm going to run a big team, like that would just be a W-2 for me. I mean, usually agencies have small margins, and so you have to grow a large multi-million dollar agency to make a real paycheck at the
Mm.
end of the day. And so there's just so many benefits if you're going to be a W-2. As a fractional, it is really that there are companies that will allow full-time W-2 to be fully remote. It is a lot less nowadays, and so if any companies are looking at W-2, or sorry, looking at fractional executives, they care about output. They don't care about hours. And so you're automatically into the set of companies that said, we see where we're at now. We want this outcome. Can you help us get to that? We don't care if it's at 8 to 5. We don't care what the hours are. Well, that's the type of people I want to talk to anyways. And it's just so hard to actually work through the hiring process to find the companies that'll care about outputs, are really very flexible on hours and when and where. And
Yeah.
so fractional just that's the pool of people that you have.
Okay. How do you find the companies, Kurt?
A lot of times it's referrals from my network. So because of my background, I am fairly active on LinkedIn and social media. So people will come to me from that, or they
Mhm.
will recommend, or sometimes people will come to me because they would like a full-time chief marketing officer, but they've had difficulty with the last one or two that they've hired. And so they'll come start a discussion about, can you help us fill the gap so we don't feel the pressure just to put a butt in the seat? And
Mhm.
as part of that conversation, then they realize you would just be a better 1 year, 2 year, 3 year person for us fractional than just a 90-day fill in the gap, which I wouldn't do.
Yeah. Okay. Other than the budget, because again, I'm just going to use round numbers
Yeah.
here. If somebody's paying, if a full-time position's $100,000 a year, they pay you a fraction of that. Obviously, the budget's there. What are the other benefits to the company of employing this type of model?
Yeah, the experience is a lot of it, but also it's the systems that come in place. And so I'm known as the king of scaling. That's what I get introduced as from a keynote
Mhm.
perspective. So, but for me or other fractionals, because we work with different companies, like if we were full time, we have the experience of working with Trello or Asana, all these project management tools by our nature, because like I'm working at companies now that are earning, 10 to $50 million a year. If I was full time, companies might be 200 to $500 million a year. There's systems in place, not just budget wise, but there's systems in place when you're a $500 million company that a $10 million company is never going to have, but they need it if they really want to scale. And I think it's very why I was interested in really talking with you and your show is that that's the same thing that I find that people need individually to go from a part-time contractor of figuring things out to making a full living is you have to figure out things that are repeatable and systems in place as an individual to be able to fulfill your household provision. It's the same thing that companies get from a benefit. And it's not just the budget, it's that they need somebody that comes in and thinks in terms of a systems mindset. How do these 12 different disparate things all work together to get the outcomes we want? And then a lot of times I find myself teaching and coaching the full-time people at the company things that they might not have had to figure out for 5 years, but it helps them get there and compress that time. Instead of figuring out in 5 years, they figure out in 5 months.
Yeah. Systems and processes are everything. And you would be surprised, and I know you wouldn't be, but you mentioned 10 to $15 million businesses are hiring fractional CFOs, CMOs, other higher level employees, maybe a finance person, right? Any other parts of the business that you see? Because again, you are a fractional. So some of these companies you work with, do they have other fractional positions as well?
Absolutely. And they're much larger companies than that. I mean, I know $200 million a year recurring revenue companies that have fractionals in there for different roles.
Mm.
It depends on the industry. And so I'm part of an organization called Fractionals United. There's about 8,000 of us that are all full-time fractionals. And there are chief people officers, people that run HR in there. That's a big deal right now as well, because like there's HR teams where it's just operations, making sure all the normal benefits are running. But there's this huge cultural bit, which HR typically doesn't run. It comes from the rest of the organization, but they help facilitate. Well, a lot of people in HR and people teams, that's not a skill set that they have. The really good fractionals will step in and say, the chief product officer, the head of marketing, the CEO, they want this to happen. I can help implement that for you. And so those roles, I know fractional chief product officers. So people that the companies are $50 million or 15 million, they have great software engineering team, but they just can't figure out that roadmap and what the product needs to do. So they bring in somebody fractional that can help steer the product team and engineering team. So almost actually every level you would look at from a C-level perspective, I see fractional roles in fractional chief general counsel, same thing. Depending on the organization, they want that experience that they otherwise couldn't afford. But it's a different relationship, like on the lawyer side, when you go to a law firm and this is your outside representative versus, hey, you're my fractional general counsel. Like that's a very different relationship. This is a firm versus you, Brian, in that role.
That's right. I wouldn't have thought about fractional general counsel. So glad you shared that. So just to tie this all back together, guys, who you're listening to this, Kurt took what he already knew how to do and turned it into a business for himself, and a lifestyle came along with that as well. So talk a little bit more, because you have a family. So talk a little bit more about what your day looks like as a result of doing this.
I mean, that's the key for me is the most important thing I can do is raise good kids in my life, in my mind. And so my legacy is going to be, after I'm gone, what are their kids like and when they're adults? And so for that, I want to make sure, of course, I have to be there for my wife. And part of that is being able to show up when she needs something. And that could be at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And so we were talking a little bit beforehand. I realized just last week, my daughter turned 2 this last November. And my mom or my wife mentions they come back from school. She goes to school 4 days a week at a church near us. As they start pulling in the driveway, Hannah Grace is going, "Daddy, daddy, daddy." Well, because she is so expected that I know that they get home at 12:05 to 12:10 every afternoon. And Life 360 tells me I try to meet them. The garage door is opening as they're pulling up the driveway. And so my daughter is expecting me to be there. And like, who gets that in a full-time W-2 role? You don't. We have a huge mountain property in North Georgia. It's important for us to spend a lot of time outside. And I also know my personal work productivity goes up and down. So if I'm awake and want to work and be productive at 11 p.m., I'm going to do that so that at 2 p.m. I could be out on our hiking trails on our property with my kids. So that's the lifestyle I've created, and the fractional non-W-2 roles allow me to do that.
Love it. I love it. Did you know that going in to the fractional world that this is how you wanted to design your day? Did you have, or did that just kind of happen?
No, I didn't know that. So the last company I was with, eXp World Holdings, never had that owns eXp Realty, never had offices. The company we had sold to them, we were output driven, and so that's the way the investors believed in. And so we all always gave each other a lot of flexibility. And when we got acquired by this public company, we were able to basically build this giant division, but also run it separately. So they were already pretty flexible. Our team, though, it was a huge bit of for 2.5 years there of how we hired and implement people. But nobody believes that really.
Mm.
And so I give the example of I had a product manager on my team that came to me after a couple months and was sheepishly like, "Hey, I'd like to go pick up my daughter a couple days a week from school. Is that okay?" Like, why are you even asking me? Because we've been telling this and preaching to them about like you could have this flexibility even at very few, but some W-2s. The PTSD, because other companies have said that and they never really allow it. I knew you could have this at a very small percentage, but if I was going to shape my personal job as I moved into something like what I'm doing now, that was critical as a primary reason. So that's also why when I work with clients, if they expect me to be at just certain hours all the time, that's not going to happen. I mean, I care about outputs, and there's always times like you have to show up at a certain time in meetings, but it's like if you want me every morning from 8 to 12, I don't think there's a number that's going to just have me do that.
Right. You're setting expectations and boundaries because again, you chose the life and then you built the business that supported that lifestyle. Most people do it the opposite way
Yeah.
around. Would you not
Yeah,
agree?
and it works in all cases. I've been trained from a public speaking perspective now by a gentleman named Vin Jang out of Australia, like literally one of the top public speakers in the world. People pay him hundreds of thousands of dollars for Zooms, much less in-person events. He stepped out of the big circuit public speaking because he had a wife and a kid, one kid at the time, and he's now, I mean, he still does some public speaking, but he was on the road 200 days a year. And he was
Yeah.
that wasn't the life that he wanted. And he said, tells a story now and part of the coaching. He says, nobody, like his wife supported him. She didn't complain about it. It was
Yeah.
only after he made the decision, we're going to move back to family in Australia, that she finally started to tell him, this is how horrible that actually was. But he, thankfully, he was proactive enough to do that as opposed to destroying a marriage. So that, like, he probably made more money than anybody would ever actually dream of in his public speaking. And he's still doing quite well. That's, you have to structure your life the way you want it to be, or somebody else will structure it for you.
I'm so glad you said that. Prioritize your life or someone will prioritize it for you. A great mentor of mine told me that once. Thanks, Kurt, for sharing that. You mentioned that you had side hustles with pretty much all of your W-2 jobs, which I think a lot of people think about who have 9 to 5s. They might dabble in it. You had some success. You sold some stuff. You had a blog that was successful. Maybe a tip or two while you were doing your W-2 as to why you were able to be successful with these side hustles. Give us some advice there. Because again, a lot of people are just kind of dipping their toe in the water.
Yeah, great question. So I say this as a sci-fi and fantasy geek. I do love Star Wars, old Star Trek, Tolkien and all. But outside of like binging on some, some of those shows, I don't watch Netflix very much. My wife and I, that's something in our household, but even before we came together, my wife didn't have cable back in the day. I don't spend a lot of time on things like that. And so I tend to look for things that I enjoy doing. So I enjoy writing. That's why the blog made sense to me. Back before when I was younger, I started a lawn care business. I ended up selling for 6 figures because I liked being outside. What I didn't like so much was I was really good at selling. And so I oversold. So I had to start hiring people. But it's like, when you look for things that you enjoy doing, you don't have to get away with Netflix. And so I think that's what too many people like. If you're an accountant by day and you don't like accounting, well, that's probably not a good side hustle for you unless you just need to cut loose. But there's probably other things that you're really good at as an accountant that you would enjoy doing. And you just have to figure out how to apply those things that people will pay you for.
Right. And I think people associate if you don't like your accounting job because you don't like going there, your boss, or the restrictions and limitations, you just kind of lump it all together. Well, I hate accounting too, but maybe you do like accounting. You just don't like anybody telling you when you got to do it.
Right.
Yeah. So find segments of that. Glad you said that. Let's talk a little bit about your speaking business. I'm definitely interested in this. Again, another thing that you did
Mhm.
from your one of your jobs or multiple jobs, and you took it to a business. How did you start getting networking, getting with speaking? Speaking engagements is a ton of networking. You must be great at it. So talk a little bit about that.
The first few came from just recommendations that I didn't even know actually took place.
Yeah.
I was speaking about industry things in our industry, but because of my role, I was a marketing and business person. Some conferences reached out, and so the first couple ones that reached out were not paying gigs. They were, hey, you have this role, come, we'll kind of comp your ticket for things. After I did just a couple of those, I was like, maybe people get paid for this, right? And so, what does it take to do that? Well, like it's the same basic thing today. Sometimes you just have it on a website as it was 20 years ago. I need to have a one sheet so that when people asked, I could be like, here's where I've spoken before, here's my audience sizes and some proof points. And so when I created that, I just did a couple reach outs to conferences I was already going to say, hey, here's topics that I can talk about. And thankfully, I had had a net weaving conversation with a friend of mine that I knew was a paid public speaker, was getting paid $12,000, $15,000 every time he would show up for something. And this was a good while ago. And I said, I think I want to do this. I don't know how to actually talk about how do I get paid. And he's like, first of all, we don't say paid for speaking, it's remuneration. And he literally just said, get out your pen and paper. And he talked me through, here's like the 12 to 15 minutes I would have that conversation. And so the next time somebody called and said they wanted to talk, I said, well, let's talk remuneration. And I basically just read through the notes that he gave me. And they offered to write me a big check. I was like, oh my gosh, that worked. And
Wow.
so I did a little bit. I mean, literally, as I've done this, some years I've been paid tens of thousands of dollars, some years hundreds of thousands of dollars. But I still, I mean, it wasn't something I was focused on. And
Mm.
so I kind of did it more when I wanted to travel a little bit. Now I know it's a business. I know people make seven figures a year from it. Some people just have very healthy feeders into other businesses, coaching businesses and consulting business. So I joined National Speakers Association in November of last year, and I'm in Atlanta. The Atlanta chapter is probably number one or number two in the world for like the most hands-on. I've literally gone to meetings where people have opened up. Here's everything I do for sales development, how my marketing works, how my sales works, so that I can learn from people that are way further than I am on this 1099 kind of like life.
Awesome. You wouldn't think that, I think a lot of people who are want to get into public speaking, the 10 to 15 per gig seems a little bit out of reach. And you just kind of stair stepped it for us where you did some free and then you worked up to that. And then you got this handy dandy script that, I'd like to get my hands on, but it worked for you, right? So how do you mentioned net weaving, you kind of glazed over that.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit more about the net weaving. How does that help you?
Yeah, so I have a friend here in Atlanta, wrote a book a couple decades ago called on the topic of net weaving.
Hmm.
I've talked to so many people, and this is so important for people that are wanting to get out of their W-2. We say you got to go network to find those opportunities, and you just like shut down because we've all been at a conference or somewhere where you hand somebody a business card or you tell them what you do, and you can watch it actually happen in their head where they go, "Yeah, I'm never going to talk to Brian again." Like they might as well have taken your business card and thrown it over their shoulder because so many people approach networking from a self-serving perspective. Net weaving is just a concept that says, look, like the best way to get to know people and for people to want to help you in the long term and build a big network where you're trusted is to say, look, when I meet you at a conference, if I meet you at church or synagogue or at the Civilians Club, is to talk to you to see how I could help you. And so like I know with my background, if I find out what's going on with you, Brian, then separately I go, I'm thinking through what you're struggling with or trying to accomplish in your business. I might just be able to carve out 12 minutes to make an introduction for you that would fundamentally change your life. So I'm looking for those ways that I can help, as opposed to what can you do for me? And so now it's not self-serving. And even if the other person is self-serving, you're out there just like trying to help the world and help people that you meet. And a lot of times, like it may not even be you. When we talk, it may be somebody that you know. And I go, well, introduce me to Amanda. I think if you've got that friend that's doing this, I can make a couple calls and introduce her to somebody.
Yeah.
And so it's a great concept. It takes the pressure away from talking and it gives you follow-up so that even introverts, like 70% of the world is actually introvert from kind of the studies. Most people don't realize that. Well, introverts don't want to go talk. Well, this gives them a process about how to go do that.
Awesome. And I agree, you have to serve and all that stuff comes back around to you because they remember that like, oh, hey, Kurt helped me with this, Brian helped me with this. And they feel probably obligated to circle it back to you, right?
There's
Um,
definitely some of that. And the other parts of it, though, is that like so much of having relationships for getting speaking opportunities or growing a fractional business and so many other opportunities I bet your audience are looking at doing is being top of mind with people. And so how do you follow back up with people? Well, like people that way, when somebody does something for me, I take note of it in my CRM as well. So that at the third level out of an introduction that you made for me 2 years ago, I have a note so that when something actually pays off, I can go back through my chain and go, hey, Brian, you don't remember, but like 3 or 4 years ago, you introduced me here. And this just happened last week. And either I was able to help somebody because of a relationship you started, or somebody was able to help me. And I just wanted to thank you for that. I now have a reason to follow up where otherwise people struggle.
yeah, that's good. That's a good tip. I like it. So I'm at a networking event because you do a lot of live stuff. And I've been in this position. I've seen this before where, you want to talk to somebody, everyone's kind of standing up against the wall, right? Twiddling their thumbs like, oh, what do I do? I got my business card. What's maybe an icebreaker that you might lead with to get that conversation going? Because I think a lot of people get stuck at that point, just
Right.
making the initial conversation.
Yeah, it depends on how forward you are. I actually find a lot of times it's easier for me to be more forward than I otherwise would like. And I didn't used to be this way. Because you're at that conference, you're at some local event. If you don't have anybody with you as like your wingman, like what do you do? I literally just look for any group and they can even be closed off in that circle. And I pursue like who do I want? And I just pick the group and I call it out. Like it's going to be somewhat awkward. Let's just make it awkward then, because then we're over that type of thing. So I will walk up to a group and just say, "Hey, I haven't met you all yet. What are you talking about?" And does it always work? No. Like, but 1 out of 50 times, like people will close off and it seems a little too private. I'm happy with a 49 out of 50 win streak, which is what it
Yeah.
typically gets. And then it gets you into that conversation.
I like that because you only need one. So,
Right.
and that's a great icebreaker. I'm going to use that next time. What are we talking about here? Now I'm really tall, so a lot of people will come up to me, and ask me that question. But sometimes I'm a little, I can be standoffish, and guys, I'm a podcast host and a speaker, and sometimes I don't want to go interrupt a group. Right? We're all, like you said, 70% of us have that introvert, mindset. Kurt, what advice would you give to, you've done a lot, right? You've done a lot in the W2 world, in a business. People want to start businesses that are listening to this show. And they're stuck. They're in a W2, they got kids like you do, and they just don't really know where to go, what steps to take. What's maybe a first step or two of advice that you would give them to get started, to get out of their own way?
The first thing I think is just writing down a list of opportunities that you think you could make a full living on.
Mm.
They could be really small at first, but it's like, hey, what could I do? I have a friend that worked for me at a company a couple companies ago. He is in another W-2 role right now, but at the last company he came from the real estate space, but was always a part-time agent. And so there's all these print on demand product companies now. So he was like, I wonder what it would take to actually create a print on demand, like sell shirts that have, fun logos and things on it.
Mhm.
Well, he talked to his son and her daughter, and they spun up something on a Saturday. And it was like, because they thought about it, was like, it's almost no investment. And if it works, it could be a whole lot of money. And so, like, but that came from him and his wife thinking about what's some things we could do that could bring in some side money, doesn't cost us tens of thousands of dollars to get started. So I think, like in his case, he's bold. He just wants to get started. He helps, he volunteer lead these like boot camps during the week for people as well. But it comes, if you don't have that, is how could I make money that's not my W-2? If it's accounting, back to that example, well, either what's within accounting or what's this skill set? What would this make me good at in somewhere else, whether it's a business or not? And then just deep dive into a whole bunch of it. I mean, there's nothing wrong with creating a plan to take things off of that list. I heard all these people talking about self-publishing like kids books and cookbooks and all these things. So I went and listened to like 25 hours of YouTube videos about what does it take to do that. And I realized like 0.1% of people are going to make a lot of money, and other people are going to make money selling me coaching programs to try to be successful in it. And I was like, okay, not something I want to do.
Yeah. But you are suggesting, hey, put your list of ideas and your interest on paper. I can't tell you how many people don't do that. It's just kind of floating around up here in your head. Externalize it. Okay, now you've got that. You've got the ideas. Where do you think people get stuck after that? Like, hey, I've got this great idea. I think it could work, but I'm just going to stay over here in my 9 to 5 job. Why
They
do you
don't
think
take
people do that?
they don't actually take the time. It's the same reason that people, don't get in shape from a working out perspective. They don't change their diet. They have a hope, but they don't change anything on their calendar. For me, it's like your actions show who you actually are. Like if you say you care about people and you want to help all these things, and I go look at your checkbook and there's no checks written, well, do you really care about the things you claim to be? I find most people just don't put the time on there. Even the researching the topics I mentioned about like self-publishing some like kids books and cookbooks. I put time on my calendar to go and research that, because otherwise it was always going to sit up there and be hey, can I make money doing that? And not only would that then not move me towards that goal, but that also takes memory that's not going to allow me to focus on anything else. And so you have to put time on your calendar and block it, and feel free to move it around, but you need to have it on there to say, I'm going to start spending some time to figure out this, or hey, I want to start doing some consulting. You want to do fractional work like me. Not everybody in Fractional United just jumped right into it. That's scary for a lot of people. Most people can't do that provision wise. Well, people put time in their calendar to start networking to go find their first fractional role.
Your calendar should reflect what's important to you.
Absolutely.
Thank you for that. Kurt, where do we go to learn more about you?
My personal website, Kurt Uhlir, uhlir.com, is the best place. I do write a ton of different content on LinkedIn, but my personal website is where I'm publishing a bunch of work on servant leadership, growing and scaling companies, and that allow people to splinter off. If you want to know more about like personal life, they'll send you over to Instagram. You want business, they'll send you over to LinkedIn.
Excellent. We'll leave that link in the show notes. I'm glad you got your name. I couldn't get my name. I couldn't get my domain name. I had to put the M in there. So good for you. Kurt, this has been awesome. I'm so glad that we met and that you shared your insights here. I love the fractional business. I have really high hopes for it. Anything else that you wanted to share with us before we wrap up here that I didn't get to ask you or that you wanted to leave us a final thought with?
Well, the two things. One is everybody that's listening, you can do this. Like you can get out of the W-2. You just have to be intentional and realize you're not always going to get it right. But the bigger thing for me, and this applies for any role you're in, but especially it applies for your W-2 role, but it especially applies as you're looking for what your 1099, what your LLC kind of thing could be. You are wrong about three things at least right now that you think you're right about. You may know exactly this is the part-time, this is the 1099 job I want. There's still at least three things that you're wrong about. And I know that because whatever role I've ever had, heck, my relationship with my wife, I look back at something that I was convinced was the right decision 6 months ago or 2 years ago. And I made the decision because like we don't make a decision knowing it's wrong. We make a decision because it feels right. And so just start asking yourself for 30 seconds, what could I be wrong about today? And then you'll start to figure out both one, it'll save you some grief, but you'll figure out those things sooner. And so rather than you taking 2 years to try to make your change off of your W-2, you might figure out in 6 months.
I like that. I really do. What can I be wrong about today? I'm going to ask myself that when we get off of here. Kurt, thanks so much for dropping your knowledge on us. I appreciate it. Look forward to having you back on sometime, everyone. Make it an awesome day.